bread was wrong, and Skye knew it before she even pulled open the oven door. She could feel it in the weight of the silence, not the comfortable pre-dawn quiet of the bakery, but the kind of quiet that comes when air pressure changes right before a storm. The sourdough loaves in the rack smelled perfect, their crusts the color of dark honey, but something outside had shifted in the last 30 seconds. The parking lot behind the building, the sound of cars. Not the rattling of a delivery truck, not a TTC bus making the early loop down Dundas. These were heavy, expensive engines cutting off in perfect synchronization. Skye pulled the last rack from the oven with her bare hands. She'd burned off most of the sensation in her fingertips years ago and set it on the cooling rack without looking up. She already knew what was coming. She'd been waiting for it the way you wait for a diagnosis you already suspect. She stripped off her flour-dusted apron and hung it on the hook beside the door that led from the kitchen to the front of the shop. Her mother had hung that hook herself 18 years ago. She'd used a level and everything, made sure it was perfectly straight. The only perfectly straight thing in a building that had been slowly settling into Toronto clay since 1962. The bell above the front door rang. Skye didn't run. She walked out of the kitchen, wiped her hands on the hem of her work shirt, and stood behind the counter. 4 men stepped through the door. 3 of them carried themselves like bouncers, wide shoulders, careful eyes, the kind of stillness that comes from practiced threat assessment. The 4th moved differently. He didn't sweep the room the way his men did. He just entered it, the way water fills whatever container it's placed in, without effort, without announcement. He was tall, maybe 6'2", in a dark charcoal overcoat that cost more than Skye's refrigeration unit. Silver was beginning at his temples. There was a scar that bisected the left side of his jaw, old, faded, the kind you stop noticing on your own face. His eyes were a shade of grey she'd only ever seen in the St. Lawrence River in October. She knew who he was. She'd known his name for 4 years, since the day her father stopped answering his phone, and she found the promissory note taped to the inside of the cash register. "You're open early," the man said. His voice was flat and Canadian, no effect, no performance, just information. "I live upstairs," Skye said. "The bread doesn't care what time it is." He walked to the counter, not the way a customer would, browsing, checking the display case. He walked the way a person walks through their own building, like he already owned the floor. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at the trays of cooling sourdough behind her, the morning mise en place she'd been prepping since 4, the handwritten chalkboard specials she changed every morning out of pure stubbornness, even on days she barely broke even. "Your father owes my organization $240,000, he said. "No preamble. No coffee first. With the accrued interest, it's $310. "My father is in Vancouver," Skye said. Her voice didn't shake. She'd practiced that, or he was, last I heard. "I haven't spoken to him in 3 years. "Debts don't follow the debtor, Miss Weston." His name was Wolfe, and she made herself think of him only by that. Not a first name, not a title, just Wolfe. A word that kept her from making the mistake of seeing him as a person too quickly. They follow the asset. He didn't leave me an asset. He left me a second mortgage and a walk-in cooler that needs a new compressor. The largest of the 3 men, thick neck, close-cropped hair, the kind of build that required custom tailoring, shifted his weight near the front window. His hand moved to the inside of his jacket. Skye watched the movement, filed it, kept her eyes on Wolfe. "I'm aware of your financials," Wolfe said. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and placed a manila envelope on the counter between them. It landed like a stone dropped in still water. "The note your father signed, the lien my people filed on this property last Tuesday when the bank sold us the debenture, the accounts receivable from your 3 wholesale clients, which, combined with the retail margin, puts you in the black by exactly $11,000 per year before your own salary." Skye stared at the envelope. Her jaw tightened. He'd done the math on her life and walked in here carrying it in a manila folder at 5:30 in the morning. "What do you want?" she said. It wasn't really a question. Wolfe reached into his other pocket. He set a small, dark box on the counter beside the envelope. He didn't open it, he just let it sit there. Skye looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then she looked back at him. "Tell me you're joking," she said. "I rarely joke," Wolfe said. "It's inefficient." "You want to marry me," she said it flatly, out loud, the word landing in the warm, yeast-scented air of her mother's bakery like a piece of broken glass. "I want a partner who understands how numbers work and doesn't frighten easily," Wolfe said. "My organization is expanding into legitimate holdings, investment firms, property management. The regulatory scrutiny is increasing. A family presence provides stability in the perception of institutional partners. You need a wife for optics. I need someone who won't be a liability. So buy a publicist." Skye felt the heat rising in her chest, the hot, clear anger that she'd learned to use instead of fear because it worked better. "Hire an image consultant. You've clearly done your homework on my P&L statement. You can afford one." The large man by the window made a sound low in his throat. Wolfe didn't look at him. "I've been in here 3 times this month," Wolfe said. "I know." He'd bought a loaf of dark rye the first time, a box of butter tarts the second, and a full order of croissants the third. He'd paid in cash each time and tipped exactly 20% with the precision of someone who'd calculated the amount in advance. You run a tight operation with very little margin for error, and you haven't missed a single supplier payment in 4 years despite the debt load your father left you. You threw out a man who tried to walk out without paying last month. You didn't call the police. You walked him back inside and made him settle the bill. He was 17. You made him pay anyway. Theft is theft. She crossed her arms. "I'm not a charity." Wolfe almost smiled. She could see it, the ghost of the expression, passing across his face like cloud shadow on water, gone before it fully arrived. He opened the small box. The ring inside caught the fluorescent light of the bakery and split it into cold prisms across the ceiling, a diamond, large and absolutely indifferent to the fact that it was wildly out of place in this room, surrounded by bread cooling racks and a chalkboard listing today's soup as roasted parsnip. "The debt disappears," Wolfe said. "The building transfers to you, free and clear. You run this place as you see fit. You attend necessary functions with me, 3, maybe 4 times a year. You don't ask questions you don't need answers to, and you don't share what you observe with anyone outside this agreement. And in exchange I smile next to a man who runs." She gestured at the envelope. "Whatever this is." "Yes." "No," Skye said. The word came out clean and final, like a seam ripping straight. She picked up the ring box, closed it with a sharp click, and pushed it back across the counter until it bumped against his hand. The air in the bakery changed temperature. The large man's hand came fully out of his jacket. One of the other 2 took a single step forward. Skye didn't move. "You walked in here at 5:30 in the morning," she said, and her voice had found its foundation now. The same voice she used with the bank, with the health inspector, with the supplier who'd tried to short her on a flour delivery. "You brought 3 men with guns and a ring, and you think that makes it a proposal. It doesn't. It makes it a kidnapping with paperwork." Wolfe's jaw shifted. A muscle moved in his cheek. "You're looking at me like I'm a spreadsheet you can optimize," Skye continued. "Like if you put the right numbers in the right columns, you'll get the output you want. I'm not an output. I've spent 4 years cleaning up my father's columns, and I'm not adding a new liability to replace the one I'd just finished paying down." She reached under the counter and pulled out the first tray of the morning's croissants. Her hands were perfectly steady. She began loading them into the display case. "I'll give you the equipment. I'll give you the wholesale contracts if they're worth anything to you. You can take the delivery van. It needs brake pads, but it runs. That's everything this place has. It won't cover 310, but it's the whole of it." Wolfe had gone very still. Not the stillness of anger. She'd expected anger, braced for it. This was something else. He was watching her the way she'd seen a hawk watch the field behind the building on early mornings, waiting to understand what it was looking at. "And if I say that's not sufficient?" he asked. Quiet, entirely quiet. "Then you'll have to shoot me," Skye said. She placed the last croissant in the case and closed the glass front. "Because I don't have anything else to give you, and I'm not going to stand in a room smelling like sourdough in my dead mother's bakery and tell a stranger that yes, I'll pretend to be his wife, thanks very much. So, your call." The silence stretched long enough that one of the men by the door started to reach for something. Wolfe raised one hand, a slight movement, not a gesture, a command. The man stopped. Wolfe looked at the ring box sitting on the counter between them. He picked it up slowly and put it back in his pocket. Then he looked around the bakery with a different kind of attention, not the appraising eye of a man calculating assets. Something slower. Something that Skye couldn't immediately name. He took off his coat. He didn't hand it to one of his men. He folded it once and laid it over the back of one of the cafe chairs near the window, with a care that was almost absurd given the circumstances. He rolled back his left cuff, then his right. Skye stared at him. "What are you doing?" she said. Wolfe looked at the stack of flour sacks in the corner of the shop. The 50-kilogram bags she hadn't gotten around to moving from the delivery pallet to the storage shelves in the back. "You've got 200 kilograms of bread flour sitting 3 feet from a fire exit," he said. "That's a code violation." "I know. I was going to move them at 6. "I'll move them now." He walked toward the pallet. Bram, the large one, closest to the window, made a sound that was almost a word, almost a protest. He thought better of it. The other 2 men exchanged a look that Skye couldn't fully interpret, but which contained, she thought, a significant amount of genuine bewilderment. Wolfe crouched, got a grip on the first 50-kilo bag, and hauled it onto his shoulder. His face showed the effort. It was a lot of weight. He carried it through the kitchen door without asking where it went. Skye, after a moment of pure baffled incomprehension, followed him. "Back shelf, left side," she said. "The right side's for semolina." He set it where she said. He went back for the next one. She stood in the middle of her kitchen and watched the head of one of Toronto's oldest criminal organizations move flour for her at 5:40 in the morning. His shirt, she noticed, was very white. It would not be white for much longer. "Why?" she said, when he came back through the 3rd time. "Your code violation would cost you $400. He didn't stop moving. I cost you that much in interest every 6 days." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. He set the 3rd bag and came back for the 4th. "You said I came here with a ledger and tried to call it a marriage. You were right." He shouldered the next bag. "I haven't earned anything in a very long time. I keep thinking I've forgotten how." She didn't say anything to that. She didn't know what to say. She made coffee instead. It was the only thing that made sense. By the time the flour was moved, she had 2 mugs on the prep table and a tray of the morning's first rye slices, still warm with butter. Wolfe sat down on a stool with the careful movements of a man whose back was beginning to register its objections. His shirt had acquired a pale dusting across one shoulder and a grease smear near the cuff. He looked at the coffee and then at her. "It's dark roast," she said. "I don't do the light stuff." He took it. They sat in the kitchen while the ovens cycled and the light outside shifted from navy to grey. Skye told him about her mother, who had built the business from a single rented counter at the St. Lawrence market and spent 17 years in this building with her hands in dough by 4 every morning. She told him about the call from the hospital, a Tuesday in November, 3 years ago, and how she'd driven over with flour still in her hair. And by the time she arrived, there was nothing left to do but make decisions about paperwork. She told him about finding the promissory note, the amount, her father's signature. His phone going to voicemail, the voicemail that was eventually disconnected. Wolfe listened without interrupting. He ate 2 slices of rye bread with a focused attention that suggested he hadn't eaten anything yet today. "My mother was sick for a long time," he said, finally. "The kitchen sounds filled the gaps, the creak of the proofing rack, the hum of the oven fan. My father kept working to pay for it. Except he didn't. He borrowed. And when the men he borrowed from came to collect, he didn't have it. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. I was 12. I watched them explain the consequences to him in our kitchen while my mother was asleep upstairs. Skye said nothing. When I was 15, Wolfe said, I went to find the men who had done that. I asked them for a job. He said it without theatre, a simple fact like reporting the weather. I learned their books first. That's where the real power was. Not the guns, the ledgers. She looked at his hands around the mug. They were scraped now, the knuckles reddened from the flour sacks. Underneath the day's damage, she could see older marks, the geography of a different kind of work, the kind that didn't wash off. You built a criminal empire, she said, because you were afraid of being the man on the floor. Yes. No hesitation, no shame, just the plain fact of it, and I became very good at it. And then one morning I woke up and realized I hadn't built anything. I'd just taken everything the previous people had built and put my name on it. And you thought marrying a baker would fix that. The corner of his mouth moved. I thought finding someone who couldn't be bought would at least tell me I hadn't entirely lost the ability to recognize something real. Skye looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee. The debt, she said. Gone, he said. It was gone before I walked in this morning. I bought it from the bank 8 days ago, not to hold over you, to close it. She set the mug down. The kitchen was very quiet. Then what was the manila envelope, she said. Proof, he said. I needed you to understand that I knew, all of it, and that I'd chosen not to use it. He reached into his shirt pocket and placed a folded receipt on the prep table between them. The building is yours. The lien is discharged. There's nothing in that envelope that threatens you anymore. Skye looked at the receipt. She didn't touch it. She read the numbers from where she sat, because she'd always been able to read upside down. One of the more useful skills you developed when you spent your childhood watching adults try to hide financial information from you. The numbers were correct. The weight that had been sitting in her sternum since she was 23, the specific physical weight of inherited debt, the kind that lived in the body and not just the mind, shifted, didn't disappear, just moved, slightly, like ice beginning to go at the edges. Why the ring then, she said, if the debt was already gone? Wolfe folded his hands on the prep table. Because if I'd come in here and said, I've already paid off your father's debt, please consider spending time with me, you'd have thanked me, shown me the door, and never spoken to me again. Skye thought about this. You wanted a fight, she said. I wanted to see what you'd do with one. That, she said, is genuinely the most manipulative thing anyone has ever said to me. I know he didn't apologize for it. She looked at the receipt again. She looked at the flour dust on his expensive shirt. She thought about the way he'd listened to her talk about her mother without making the sounds people usually made. The soft, sympathetic noises that were really just requests for the story to end, so the conversation could move on to something more comfortable. He hadn't made any of those sounds. He'd just listened. Come back tomorrow morning, she said. He looked at her. If you want to know what I'm worth, she said, you don't get to decide by looking at my books. I'm going to put you to work. She stood up and began clearing the mugs. I open at 7. The walk-in inventory doesn't do itself, and the person I had helping me Tuesday mornings quit last month to go back to school. You want to understand what this place actually is, you come in and you work a Tuesday morning. Wolfe stood slowly. He buttoned his cuffs, a futile effort given the state of them, and reached for his coat. What time? He said. 4:30, she said, and don't wear that coat. He showed up at 4:25 in dark canvas work pants and a jacket that was clearly expensive, but practical enough to survive actual labor. He didn't bring his men. He didn't bring the ring. He brought coffee from the Tim Hortons on Gerrard, 2 double-doubles, and set one on the counter without saying anything. Skye looked at it, looked at him. Double-doubles a guess, he said. I don't actually know how you take it. It's fine, she said. Come in. He worked. He wasn't graceful at it. He'd spent too many years being the man who gave orders to be naturally efficient at taking them. But he was strong, and he didn't complain, and he followed instructions precisely. She showed him the walk-in inventory system, the way she coded the daily waste, the rotation logic for the proofing rack. He asked 2 questions. Both were the right questions. By 6 o'clock, with the first batch of bread cooling and the display case loaded, they were both leaning against the prep table with the specific exhaustion of early morning physical work, and Skye was explaining the wholesale pricing structure to him. Not because he'd asked, but because he'd been looking at the invoice board long enough that she thought he might actually want to understand it. He did. "Your margin on the wholesale accounts is 32%, he said, "but you're carrying 41% of your monthly labor into that channel. You're subsidizing them." "I know, but the wholesale accounts pay net 30, which smooths the cash flow enough to cover the variable costs in retail. It's a hedge. What if you restructured the net 30 to net 15 with a 2% discount for early payment?" "I've thought about it. One of the 3 clients would walk." "Which one?" "The hotel on King Street. They're on a tight construction margin." "That hotel is going to be sold in 8 months, Wolfe said. "Their parent company is in receivership proceedings in Quebec. It won't be public for another 6 weeks. Skye looked at him. "How do you know that?" she said. "I have a shareholder in the parent company," he said, entirely matter of fact. She thought about that. "Then I should be restructuring the terms now," she said, "before the transition, so the new owners inherit the new rate." "Yes." She looked at the invoice board for a long moment. "You could have said that to me the first morning," she said, "instead of the ring." "I know. Why didn't you?" Wolfe was quiet for a moment. "Because I wanted to show you what I could offer," he said, "instead of what I could explain." He looked at the display case, the chalked specials board, the small wooden sign above the door that read Westerns in her mother's handwriting, transferred to a vinyl cut when the original faded. "I'm not good at showing. I've spent a long time being useful only because of what I control, not what I understand." The bakery opened. The morning rush was small but loyal, the neighborhood regulars, a table of 3 who came in for the soup and stayed for an hour, a woman who bought a full loaf of dark rye every Tuesday without variation. Skye worked the counter. Wolfe stayed in the kitchen and ran prep without being asked, and when one of the cafe chairs broke a leg mid-morning and a customer lurched sideways, it was Wolfe who caught the chair and the customer simultaneously, and set both upright without drawing attention to himself. The customer thanked him. He nodded once. The customer left. Skye from behind the counter caught his eye. He looked, briefly, like a person who wasn't entirely sure what to do with being thanked. She looked away before he could see that she'd noticed. The trouble arrived on a Thursday. Skye was in the back reconciling the week's receipts when she heard the bell above the front door ring in the wrong way. Too fast, too hard. She came out of the kitchen to find 2 men standing in the middle of the shop who had not come in for bread. They were young, mid-20s, carrying the restless, twitchy energy of people low in a hierarchy and resentful of it. One of them had already flipped the open sign to closed. The other was holding a phone, filming the space with the casual menace of someone who wants to make clear they're documenting a threat. "Looking for the man in the expensive shirts," said the one with the phone. "Word got out he's been spending his mornings here. Management wants a conversation." "There's no one here but me," Skye said, "and you'll want to flip that sign back before you become liable for lost business." The one without the phone laughed. It was the kind of laugh that was mostly for himself. The back door opened. Wolfe came through from the kitchen. He was carrying a bag of semolina he'd been moving to the lower shelf. He still had the bag in his hands. He set it down carefully on the nearest table, in the way of a person who has learned not to move suddenly in rooms with unknowns in them. He looked at the 2 men. "Harmon sends regards," said the one with the phone. "Tell Harmon," Wolfe said, and his voice had changed. The flat evenness he wore around Skye stripped away to reveal something older and more elemental underneath. That if he has a concern about my activities, my office line is in the business registry. There's no need to walk into a civilian business in the middle of the week. He's concerned you're going soft. That's a concern you can relay by phone. He wants it delivered in person. What happened next was quick and unpleasant, and Skye watched all of it. Wolfe moved with an economy of effort that she found more frightening than speed. Everything he did was minimal and precise, and within 30 seconds both men were on the floor. The phone was in Wolfe's hand, screen cracked. He set it on the counter, looked at the man who could still respond to questions. "This isn't a conversation you walk back from on your own," Wolfe said. "Take your associate and go." They went. Wolfe stood in the middle of the bakery and didn't move for a moment. When he finally turned around, he wore the expression of a man who has just been reminded, in the middle of a new experiment, of the exact conditions the experiment was designed to escape. "You're bleeding," Skye said. He looked down. The heel of his right hand, where he'd caught himself on the edge of a table, was open. "Come in the back," she said. "I have a kit." "You don't have to." "You're bleeding on my floor," she said. "Come in the back." She sat him on the stool and cleaned the cut with the focused, impersonal attention she gave to anything mechanical that needed fixing. The cut was shallow. She wrapped it efficiently with first aid tape from under the counter, pressing firmly until the bleeding slowed. Wolfe sat still and let her work. "They'll be back," she said, "not a question." "No," he said, "they won't." "Because you'll handle it." "Yes." "The same way you move those flour sacks," she said, "just efficiently, without a lot of theatre." He was quiet. "And then someone else will send someone else," she said, "and you'll handle that too. And this will keep being the shape of things." "Yes," he said, "that is the shape of things." She finished the bandage. She sat back and looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't exist," she said. "I'm not going to put a ring on my finger and smile at your partners and tell myself I don't know where the money comes from. I'm not built for that." "I know," he said. "But," she looked at the display case, at the sign in her mother's handwriting. "You know who my wholesale accounts are. You knew about the hotel. You have information this business needs to survive, and you understand how numbers work because you've been running them your whole life." He said nothing. He was listening. "I'm not for sale," she said. "You already know that. But a partnership is different from a sale." She stood and began cleaning the work surface with the same methodical care she applied to everything. "You want a wife for optics. I don't want that. I don't want optics. And I don't want a transaction, and I don't want to owe you anything." She looked at him. "But if you want to come in on Tuesday mornings and move flour, and tell me when my wholesale clients are about to go into receivership, and if I can keep the books for whatever legitimate holdings your organization is expanding into, then that's a conversation worth having." Wolfe looked at her for a long time. "That's not what I offered you," he said. "No," Skye said. "It's what I'm offering you." He came back on Tuesday, and Wednesday, and the Thursday after the one with the trouble. He came in at 4:25 with the same double-double every time, always guessing wrong about how she took her coffee, and getting slightly closer to right each week, a 1 sugar by the 3rd week, which was at least in the right direction. Bram stayed at the end of the block, not guarding exactly. Just present. Skye stopped noticing him after the first week, the way you stopped noticing the train on the lake shore. On a Tuesday morning 6 weeks in, Wolfe arrived to find her sitting at the prep table with her laptop open and a look on her face that he'd come to recognize, the expression she wore when she'd found an error in someone else's numbers, and it was a significant one. "What is it?" he said. She turned the laptop toward him. It was the operating statements for a property management company, one of the legitimate holdings which she'd been reviewing as a side arrangement, an hour here and there, entirely off the record. "Your property manager is skimming," she said. 11% off the top of the maintenance budget. Routed through a vendor that doesn't exist. Been doing it for 2 years. I found it in 40 minutes. Wolfe looked at the screen. He looked at her. You found this in 40 minutes, he said. I could have done it in 25, but your filing system is chaotic. He sat down across from her. He looked at the numbers she'd circled, the red thread of the discrepancy she had mapped from account to account, with the methodical patience of someone who genuinely loved the logic of an honest ledger. He said quietly, You're remarkable. You're losing $4,000 a month to an imaginary vendor, she said. I'm annoyed, not remarkable. Both, he said. She looked up. He had his hands flat on the prep table. In 6 weeks, those hands had moved flour and scrubbed cooling racks and caught a broken chair and gotten cut on a table edge and been bandaged by her in this kitchen. No ring on them. Neither did hers. That had never been the point. I don't want optics, he said. His voice had the quality of something being said for the first time, worked out in real time rather than prepared in advance. I want to know what comes after the ledger is honest. Skye looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the Toronto morning was breaking grey and cold over the lake, the kind of March light that promised nothing but eventually delivered spring anyway. Slowly, without drama, on its own terms. Coffee, she said. The good kind, not whatever that is. She nodded at the Tim Hortons cup. You've been guessing wrong for 6 weeks. It's 1 sugar, no milk. You were close 3 weeks ago. He almost smiled. It was getting easier to see when it was coming. And after the coffee, he said. After the coffee, she said, turning back to the laptop. You fix the property manager situation. I finish the operating statements. And you tell me what the next filing looks like. She could hear the smile this time, even without looking. It sounded like something that had been a long time coming. Careful, and earned, and finally allowed to arrive.